I want to begin by saying that the cosmos is not what several centuries of Christian and secular thought have called this world by opposing it to the heavens. Here today, I want to talk about the cosmos indirectly, in fact, by starting with what the cosmos is and is not. I want to talk incidentally about something that the liberation that, in fact, the European critique of heaven and its model of emancipation have failed to bring about, so much so that this critical tradition has never ceased to seek God or heaven on this earth and to desire salvation here below in this world instead of abandoning it to itself or fully renouncing all salvation. It is by wanting the earth to bear the burden of heaven that Western industrialism has turned the planet upside down. The planet not only exists without us, it doesn't make sense in opposition to any sky or heavens. Our belonging to a planet which is indifferent to us can only be uncovered if the earth is liberated from the burden of bearing the burden of the sky. I want to call cosmos precisely this liberation. For one can only become terrestrial or cosmic if one interrupts the humanizing imperial representations of heaven on this earth. This planet, or cosmos in my understanding, is precisely what remains when earth ceases to be referred to any heaven as bare earth or earth in all its nakedness. So is this world another name for the globe, the planet, or earth? In a crucial sense, saeculum is the Latin Christian understanding of this world as opposed to other worldly worlds, hell, heaven, but also the underground or the dreaming, both interworlds and overworlds. As the otherworldly has been progressively defined as unreal or delusional, the secular has come to be seen as exhausting reality. This exhaustion, of course, can be described or has been described as nature, and I want to suggest that this is precisely one of the many deaths of what we call the cosmos. But for this erasure of other worlds to happen, one needed to dissolve the reality of heaven and otherworldliness by reducing it to this world precisely. Hence, earth has been asked to bear the burden of heaven, and transcendence therefore was not made absent, it was dissolved by being realized without, or precisely in fact, within immanence and as immanence. This gesture is what Hegel famously called absolute knowing in his Phenomenology of Spirit. Throughout his philosophical journey, he considered Christianity as the only religion surpassing religion itself, a dialectical movement he called the death of God decades before Nietzsche. But instead of dissolving transcendence in immanence by, to some extent, transcendentalizing the latter, as Hegel does, I want to argue today that both immanence and transcendence should be dissolved. And in what follows, I want to redefine the cosmos as the act of their shared dissolution beyond the Greek etymology of the word. So precisely what I want to do is not to think what is or what has been the cosmos, for example, as something bounded or finite as opposed to something infinite, but to try and think about the cosmos today. This precisely comes from the fact that whether we like it or not, we use or we presuppose the word cosmos when we talk, for example, about indigenous cosmologies without necessarily trying to determine or define why we use cosmos as an anthropological category that would make sense beyond the Greek, but also be the Greeks and the Greek and Greek philosophy, but also beyond the West. So this is what I want to sort of try and clarify. I want to begin by saying that the cosmos is a distinctive concept which is irreducible to nature, irreducible to the global, irreducible to the earth, irreducible to the planet. Irreducible doesn't mean to say that it has no connections with these concepts, but it's not reducible to them. It refers for us today, I want to tentatively propose, to the ways in which we humans can imagine alternative relations with the planetary when faced with the possibility of our species' self-destruction and the shared sense of catastrophe that defines the contemporary human condition. Cosmos thinking is what helps to see the world as. And this cosmos thinking has been important for both philosophy and science, and still is today. In Western intellectual traditions, common analogies or metaphor include seeing the world as a polis, as an organism, as a theater in which each of us play a prescribed role more or less freely, or in fact as a machine governed by a deus ex machina. Hence, what modern science calls nature is a sort of derivation or a transformation of, in fact, cosmos thinking, even though some historians have called nature the very death of the cosmos. Cosmopolitan thinking today might philosophize along these images to make sense of the Anthropocene, haunted as we are by the specter of the end of the world as we know it. The remnants or the traces of the idea of the cosmos can thus help us imagine and thus conceptualize forces that weave the threads between the worlds and their edges, thus situating the human form of life in the broader realm of the planetary. So, as you know, the cosmos is, of course, an antique category which predates the Christian divide between heaven and the earth, this world and the others. And I'm more interested in this specific function of the word cosmos than about it being bounded or it being a totality. Cosmopolitanism, in turn, is sometimes defined as the politics of the world and of this world, which is something I want to try and complexify and to some extent challenge. This definition tends to identify the cosmos with the world and surreptitiously, in fact, with the secular. Instead, I want to suggest that cosmopolitanism is neither a form of secularism nor a kind of political theology. And interestingly, the etymology of the Greek word cosmos indicates perhaps another mode of thinking by dissolving precisely any division between this world and the others. The cosmos, in fact, as we know, does not refer to the world itself, but more precisely to the order of the world, or the world as ordered. And one begins to think cosmically when, for instance, one considers oneself as a citizen of a terrestrial community. The notion of citizenship thus indicates that the separation between the cosmos and the cosmopolitan is dubious because it is already premised upon the modern division between nature and culture, we could say ethics and the cosmos, that scholars have rightly put into questions. For the Greeks and the Roman, in fact, one can argue that the cosmos is already political, and to some extent cosmopolitical is redundant in a way. And this is also why the cosmos is not just one political concept among others, but one concept of the political before its reduction to what we call now the modern state, right? Conversely, the political is cosmic and needs to be organized by obeying the rules which precisely govern the physis. The cosmos designates these norms as well as the whole itself in different versions. And this the cosmic thinking, for example, of Pythagoreans asserts that rhythms and harmonies govern the cosmos, while Plato, as we know, identified this cosmic harmony to justice itself. But despite essential differences between antique philosophers, the varying language of the cosmopolitical question question two hasty ontological distinctions between the physical and the metaphysical. So what would it entail to think along these lines today? And is there something in the ecological crisis that authorizes a new kind of appropriation of such antique cosmo-metaphysical language, which emerged before Athena became, in fact, Western? And could this gesture lead us on other pathways than animist methodologies or neo-pagan re-enchantments? So I was talking about what mutual or shared dissolution of heaven and earth might look like. And instead of how can I say that, going Gaia, I want to go somewhere else and quote the metaphysician and anti-colonial fighter Amer Abdelkader when he writes in his Kitab al-Mawaqif, "The real has stolen my illusionary eye from me and has brought me near to my real eye, and the disappearance of the earth has brought the disappearance of heaven." End of quote. I want to read this quote logically, or if you like, philosophically, but by simply emphasizing the fact that what we call the mystical is a form of reasoning. Because if heaven disappears, of course, earth disappears too, and vice versa. The disappearance of heaven implies the dissolution of earth. Heaven, in fact, is not the divine, and it does not exhaust the metaphysical. It is a relative term that depends on the very concept of this world. Along these lines, I want to rethink about the cosmos as this act of dissolution, questioning the divide between religion and secularity, heaven and earth, this world, and the others. In fact, since the Greeks, one could argue, the cosmos has always been more or less linked to the unity of heaven and earth, most often identifying the heavens with planets, in fact, as we know, other than Earth, and their very movement. The sky or the heaven came to designate transcendence only when, having invented nature, the moderns began to name that which went beyond it supernatural. Like many other representations of non-Christian and non-European traditions, Abdelkader does not speak of transcendence when he speaks about heaven. Heaven is part of what we will call immanence, in fact, or what I would prefer to call today the cosmos. The Arabic word for transcendence, in fact, is tanzih. Strictly speaking, it signifies not another world, but the incomparability that signals not the existence of a world other or above our own, or above this world in the heavens, but the radical and absolute singularity of the real, which is completely different in terms of grammar. God, in this context, is described not as a father, not even as a principle, and even less as a supreme being, but as the real, al-haq. This real lies beyond being because it lies beyond the opposition between being and non-being. It troubles this opposition. The overcoming of this opposition between existence and non-existence is what Abdelkader called barzakh. This is the place, in fact, where the dead reside and haunt the living, like the specters of Amazonian tribes. Like a dreamlike spiritual double of the world, the barzakh is a place of our dreams and the matter of the dreaming among aborigines or indigenous peoples of America, or at least it's comparable. Cosmos, one might object, of course, is a Greek word. And what does it become in other languages? And how do we say this world and the cosmos, for example, in Arabic, to take only one example? Is it the same as cosmos or this world? Can cosmos or the world be translatable in other forms in other grammars? And in fact, and this is a question I want to add, even though it's indirectly linked to our question today, is the very concept of ontology, or even being, fully translatable? In Arabic, alam means world, and in the Quran, God is described as Rabb al-Alameen, literally the sustainer of the worlds or of the pluriverse, which is something different than the ruler or the king of the world. There are at least two ways of saying this world. The first one is dunya, the world as we know it, and the second is more philosophical, is hada al-alam, that does not necessarily imply that the other world is the world beyond, because it also includes worlds in between, or imaginal worlds. Kaun is the closest word to the Greek cosmos, to the Greek word cosmos. But it does mean, in fact, the universe as a plurality of worlds. But more precisely, perhaps, kaun is the result of kun, which is the act of creation that is sometimes translated as be. Kun doesn't mean cosmos, but it means order, or rather, it's the order itself in the sense of a command that gives existence to the multiple worlds. It literally creates the phenomena of wujud, which means existence, and of alam, the world, or in fact the world, if one talks about alamin. Kun, as I said, is often translated as be, because precisely it's translated as part of the sentence kun fayakun be, and it became. Interestingly enough, the word, in fact, depending on context, means be or become. I want to emphasize here that being is a verb that does not have the same function as in European languages and thus also as in Greek, precisely because being, as we know, is not the copula. Kana, the verb being, or translated as being, can only be used in the past tense, like in kana fi zaman, not, in fact, in the present. Hence, in fact, the whole identification of being in presence by Western metaphysics is made irrelevant here. Being, therefore, cannot be described cannot be used, in fact, to describe the totality of worlds in Arabic. It is a verb that gives order and reality, but not a totality itself. Wujud, in fact, means existence and event, whereas al-haq means reality. And neither of those are fully reducible to Aristotelian ontology. The act of creation is thus irreducible to an ontologic act of making being out of nothing, like creation ex nihilo. It is the formation of cosmos or kaun in which mutable worlds coexist and overlap. Noted Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi wrote a book called Shajarat al-Kaun, which is translated as the tree of the universe, or in fact, we could say the tree of cosmos. In this book, Arabi defines kun, so be, as a seed that was to some extent planted by the creator and which grows into a tree of becoming, emphasizing that nothing is a thing, but all existence is made of events that grow as one living process, a cosmological intuition that was redeployed by Mohamed Iqbal centuries later, hence the Bergsonian reference. The Shajarat is not Gaia, I want to emphasize. Yet it helps us to see the cosmos as a living process that is neither a totality nor a personal entity. Creation is made of two letters, Kaf and Nun. So this is why it's seen, in fact, as letter. The body also, because of the analogy between the macrocosm and the microcosm, could be seen, in fact, as being made of letters. But in fact, as Ibn Arabi notes, it is divided by the liminality of an absent letter, a non-manifested intermediary space called precisely a barzakh. This means that each existent is a word of the book of creation, but it also means that at the heart of the cosmos was neither nothingness nor being, precisely because the non-manifested letter sustaining the act of creation was a form of metaphysical void. It points towards a trans-ontological ground of the cosmos, cosmos being in fact a barzakh or an isthmus, that questions the stability of our very concept of what is and what isn't, and from this point of view, cosmology, in fact, dissolves ontology. So you can't just say, haha, yes, cosmology, ontology, it's kind of the same, as we do, in fact, sometimes. The cosmos has no comprehensive unity because only the real can be seen as the one. So cosmos, from this point of view, is not one. It's a multiplicity of worlds whose points of unity or monads are but traces of a oneness that always exceeds them. Hence, there is no strict opposition between the infinite world and the organized and bounded cosmos, as we tend to think when we only look at the history of science as being internal to the West, right? That is, from the Greeks to the moderns. For the very same reason, as I've already said, there is no transcendence of God per se. There is only but a radical and absolute dissimilarity of the real and the one to the point of being singular and incomparable, thus allowing worlds to multiply. Because the cosmos is not the one, it is a barzakh between the real and absolute nothingness. This description of creation is probably comparable to the myth of the tree of the world, but also to what in some Hindu traditions is defined as the chant of universe, or the Om being the primal sound that gives birth to the universe. But in turn, I want to say now that this detour helps us see something or say something about the Greek cosmos, and in fact, more precisely, about the Pythagorean matrix of the cosmos. First, I want to tentatively suggest that the very concept of cosmos emerges and stabilizes only as music is understood as mathematical or governed by number. The cosmos is therefore apprehended as a musical and harmonic order. Hence, the separation between nature and culture can be seen as much later than the separation between ethics and the cosmic. Justice, as we see in Plato, very profoundly in my view, is a harmonic composition of the soul which would be meaningless if there was no affinity between the human soul and the cosmic harmony itself. As a result, I would argue that modern science has not moved on from a closed universe to a mathematized infinite nature, but that the historical process has been a bit more complex, in fact. If only because the machine nature, or the nature machine of the moderns, could only be formulated as a form of cosmic thought. The Copernican revolution is not only a naturalist revolution, if only in fact because the very notion of a music of the cosmos, and in fact a music of the spheres, is not absent from his work. To some extent, it was a Pythagorean revolution. Precisely because, according to him, the heliocentric system explained the harmony of the universe, and particularly the frequency of the planets' retrograde motion, precisely when the Ptolemaic system itself in fact inspired by Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle, couldn't. So I want to say that astronomical debates of that kind were therefore metaphysical, ethical, and musical, before they could even be called modern science or scientific. And this is this kind of unity that we have, of course, lost. I wanted to say something, but I might not have the time, about the fact that even Kepler, in fact, on the eve of the 17th century, deployed, in fact, this vision of the music of the cosmos, in fact, attributing voices, specific voices to each planet. Mercury, for example, was a soprano, Mars was a tenor, Saturn was a bass, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that so-called modern science has only mathematized reality, made it mathematical, by reinvesting the thought of Pythagoras and Plato, the matrix of the cosmos, if you like, against the dominant Aristotelianism of medieval scholasticism. Indeed, in fact, as a remark, it was Aristotle who first mocked the idea of a celestial symphony in his treatise on the sky. Do I have some time left?
Yeah, you have 6 minutes.
6 minutes, that's fine. I thought it was going to be a bit more short. So I guess I want to say that the mediation via metaphysics, or even to some extent mystical thinking, is not made, in my view, in the spirit of a sort of anti-scientific perspective, quite the opposite. But of course, I'm going to say something that might not be accepted by everybody, but I suspect that sometimes non-scientists have a much more, how can I say that, disenchanted vision of science than scientists themselves. I want to say, in fact, that the practice of science has not completely moved away, in fact, from what I called this musical cosmos. And to some extent, the fact that, that there is a sort of rationality within mysticism is something that is not completely different, in fact, from this kind of cosmic thinking I was trying to describe. And it might be a form of rationality that is more, quote-unquote, universalizable than the one imposed in the West with the reign of extractive technoscience, which in fact is not the same as science itself, but is science in the hands of capitalism. Today, in fact, one can argue that the idea of the music of the cosmos still exists, even though the chant of the planets is a silent music of light. And in fact, both the ancient and the modern said that if there was a music of the cosmos, we wouldn't be able to hear it. It's a very old idea. It's, of course, silence. But I want to talk about a new kind of, new form of science. I mean, it's not a new form, it's a new science to some extent, which has recently emerged, apparently, and which is called stellar seismology. And one of the sort of, research unit that deploys this kind of research program says, I quote from them, "The only way to probe the interior of stars is to analyze the seismic waves that move them in order to gather information about their internal structure and the complex dynamic processes taking place within them." End of quote. In other words, the sun, for example, vibrates because of light waves that we can translate into sound waves, and that makes us able to hear the humming of the sun. So my point, in other words, is that this kind of endeavor reinvents the cosmos. It's not exactly the same as the old cosmos, by reasserting, to some extent against Aristotle and alongside Pythagoras, Plato, and even Kepler, the music of the universes. Now, a final note about cosmopolitics, because after all, we're supposed to talk about the political. Which is a few remarks about Kantian and, maybe anti-Kantian cosmopolitanism, sorry. So a few remarks, and then I'll end. I just want to suggest that if cosmopolitanism is defined as a global extension of citizenships beyond borders, it presupposes probably today something quite different from a global institution, such as the UN or even a state of states, a federation, which in my view is difficult to examine without or beyond the specter of what I try to call imperiality. In my view, what we call the cosmopolitic core cannot take place today without a rejection of state sovereignty and its logic of imperial war. I want to remind us that the inaugural declaration of cosmopolitanism, or cosmopolitics rather, associating the cosmos and the polis, is a cynical gesture. And it cannot be separated from an ethos of dissidence towards the city, or the state in our case, and its imperial integration into a federation of states. To call oneself a citizen of the cosmos is not to call oneself a citizen of the globalized capitalist world or of this world. It means not only sharing this citizenship with all the inhabitants of the earth, plants and animals included, but also that the only city that exists is the one we already inhabit, which will always escape, in fact, the power of the states. It's also a reminder that states are states that have divided the earth into territories, that the states of the earth, the physical states of the earth, are a product of how the states have governed the earth itself, And to recall the cosmos, even though differently from its matrix, is to recall this inappropriable matrix and the existence of a shared citizenship of humans and living beings that goes beyond the institutions of imperial states. This ethico-political citizenship is, of course, a form of counter-citizenship or alternative citizenship, but it reasserts the music of the universe against the petty business of claiming God on earth by stealing lead and killing human lives. Thank you.